Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video on Alberic de Bordeleaux. Now, Alberic is one of the named legendary lords who is coming up in the Total War Warhammer Old World Edition, which will see the addition of Bretonnia. And the legendary lords they've named are, of course, Lioncoeur, who is already in the game. We're going to get the Fey Enchantress, and the third legendary lord is Alberic. The Green Knight isn't mentioned as a legendary lord, but as he appears here in the promotional artwork for the Old World Edition, I imagine he may either become a legendary hero or a hero that perhaps can be summoned to the battlefield, maybe by the Fey Enchantress. That will have to wait to be seen. Do click on the top right icon that should be popping up just now to see my lore video on the Green Knight. It covers a lot of the early history of Bretonnia as well, and it's quite a good watch, if I don't say so myself. But Alberic himself is quite an unusual choice. Alberic, the Duke of Bordeleaux, hasn't ever appeared on the tabletop before. There's no real images of him. He's never been a model. So Creative Assembly have really taken a rather odd decision with this one, in my view. In the latest edition of the Bretonnian army books, the only named characters were, in fact, Lioncoeur, the Fey Enchantress, and the Green Knight. But that hasn't always been the case. That was just in the latest edition. So it's not like Creative Assembly had no other choice but to invent a character. In fact, in the 5th edition of the games, there is a plethora of colourful characters to choose from, including Réponse de Lyonnaise, essentially the Warhammer world's Joan of Arc. It follows a very similar story to the story of Joan of Arc herself. We had Baron Odo and his henchman, Solomon the Saracen, which would have been an interesting addition as a double act. In terms of double acts, we also had Tristan le Trombolier and his jester friend. As a double act, would have been fantastic to see a lunatic jester wandering around the battlefield of Total War Warhammer. And if you had to have the legendary lord be a duke, why not pick Tancred, the Duke of Quesnel? Tancred's known to have a legendary feud and a vendetta against Kemmler, one of the legendary lords for the Vampire Counts faction. So why not bring him into the game and let them play out that vendetta on the Total War Warhammer campaign map? That would have been a great little addition with a bit of story potential added in for you. So I'm not 100% sure why they picked Alberic to be the legendary lord for Bretonnia, but they did, which leads to some more questions about how restrained they are to only having 8th edition characters in the game and not characters from early editions. So that's a bit strange, but we'll see how it goes. In terms of what we do know about Alberic, we know he's a descendant of Marcus de Bordeleaux, the first Duke of Bretonnia. And Marcus rode with the founding father of Bretonnia, Gilles le Breton, who is in fact the Green Knight I mentioned earlier. So do check out that video after this one if you do get a chance. And together they fought back all the forces of evil, shall we say, that were threatening Bretonnia, such as the Greenskins, Beastmen, Norscan raiders. And in fact, this is a picture of Marcus fighting the leader of Norscan raiders who had taken over the village of Longueuil, next to Corogne, in the north of Bretonnia, and he challenged the leader of the Norscan raiders to single combat upon the landmark lighthouse they have there, and he beat him and kicked his body off the edge, and whoever the winner of the duel was, the other army would retreat. The Norscans then stuck to their word and retreated. Marcus went on to rule the lands of Bordeleaux in the newly formed Kingdom of Bretonnia. During one of his escapades, either before the campaign of Gilles le Breton or after, I'm not 100% sure myself, he was fighting off Norscan raiders from his coastline. In the midst of this fight, he was joined by Manan, the imperial god of water. Well, not necessarily just the imperial god, the human god, shall we say, of the ocean. Now, the Bretonnians themselves, since the campaign of Gilles le Breton, took to worshipping the Lady of the Lake. This Lady of the Lake worship is taken very seriously in Bretonnia. It's punishable at death if you're a heretic of any kind towards the lady. But in terms of the ocean, where water turns salty, as far as the Bretonnians see it, that is still the realm of Manan, the sea god. And so in Bretonnia in particular, they have a strong affiliation with Manan, the sea god, and that is shown in their crest, which honors Manan, the sea god, by featuring his trident on their shields. In terms of Bordeleaux itself, being featured on the coast, and their ongoing worship of Manaan, they very much become the largest port, perhaps with the exception of Longueuil, to the north of Bretonnia, but they're effectively the largest port of Bretonnia that houses a large proportion of the Bretonnian navy. It's also vital for trade with the High Elves, trade with the Empire, trade with the Dwarves via Barak Var. So you'll see a number of different faces and characters in the town of Bordeleaux itself. In fact, it's the closest thing that Bretonnia has to the classic notion of a city, whereas most of its other outposts really just have the peasantry working in the fields and the nobles in their own chateaus and castles, which are essentially just highly fortified war defenses and sort of luxurious living, I suppose, compared to the housing of the peasantry. So Bordeleaux is really the only real city of Bretonnia, as it were, because it does have a lot of like pop-up houses. There's an urban population that lives there because they can make a living from trade rather than just farming off the land. And Bordeleaux itself is well renowned for its wine. So it exports large amounts of that wine across the world, although the locals are kind of regarded as sort of a bunch of boisterous drunks for the most part. They sort of revel in their own wine, and much of it is actually consumed locally rather than being exported for profit. And they're sort of known as a boisterous, fun-loving people who enjoy a tipple now and again. In terms of their religion, as I said, the lady is very much worshipped in Bordeleaux, but Manaan is equally taken into consideration. There is in fact the great temple to Manaan, which is at the mouth of the natural harbour of Bordeleaux and sort of sits out there, and people have to row to get to what's regarded as his temple, which is this old ship that's been there for many, many years and weathered through storms and all sorts of calamities. And because of this, they feel that this ship has been blessed by Manaan, so it became his temple. The Temple of Manaan does not allow the high sort of ambassadors of the religion of the Lady of the Lake into its temple or aboard the ship that represents Manaan's temple. So that means that prophetesses aren't allowed, the Fey Enchantress isn't allowed, Grail Knights aren't allowed, and Grail Knights aren't allowed onto the ship either. So it really is just a bustling town of trade, of naval military might that guards its coast against any pirates or what have you, or even a possible high elf or dark elf invasion. This is the home of the Bretonnian navy and really plays an important part in Bretonnia as a whole. Above the harbour, there's a natural formed cliff where the fortress of Bretonnia itself lies, and that is armed with a number of artillery pieces crewed by some of the most skilled engineers in Bretonnia itself. It's said that they can actually pick out a rowboat in the harbour, hit it with their ballistics, and not affect any ship to either side, and that's just a wee rowboat, mind you. Bordeleaux, like many of the other cities of Bretonnia, or fortresses or castles of Bretonnia, was built upon elven ruins, as the elves used to have a thriving colonial kingdom in the land that has now become known as Bretonnia. Bordeleaux is fairly unique as to the degree of the ruins that had actually been left over and were reusable by the Bretonnians, so they just built upon those fortifications to establish their castles. In terms of the Count himself, he's quite a stark contrast to the people of Bordeleaux. People of Bordeleaux, as I mentioned, enjoy a tipple, are known as quite a boisterous bunch. Well, this is particularly common amongst the peasantry, but Alberic himself is known to be a very stark and stern man, and he has some unbelievable degree of self-discipline and self-control, it's said. He, like many of the nobles of Bretonnia, has little love for the peasantry as a whole, and although he recognizes that his people can be boisterous by the quayside of Bordeleaux, he doesn't like this neighborhood or this aspect of the city, and on occasion sets about clearing out the sort of boisterous taverns and inns that tend to populate that part of the city. It's said that if plague ever spread to the city of Bordeleaux around the quayside, Alberic would not hesitate to burn down that entire part of the city, and it would cause him an amount of relief to be rid of the boisterous and loutish drunks that inhabit that part of his fair city. It's kind of implied that he doesn't drink, and he insists that all of his knights don't drink, and all of his knights behave in the disciplined and absolutely stark manner in the way in which he lives his life, and they emulate that. For this reason, he actually has one of the smallest knights' households of any Bretonnian lord. but the knights he does have are considered some of the most elite within the borders of Bretonnia. Alberic himself never became a Grail Knight, and because of this, he was actually able to be the first Duke of Bordeleaux to visit the Temple of Manan, which I mentioned earlier. The reason he never became a Grail Knight was that his father had actually passed away while he was still on his errantry, it's called. Now, for those of you who don't know, I've mentioned it a couple of times in previous videos, but essentially the Knights of Bretonnia go through a kind of career path. They're squires at first, then they become Knights Errant, and then Knights of the Realm, and then after they're Knights of the Realm, if they want to look to become Grail Knights, they have to become Questing Knights for a while, and then if they get the blessing of the Lady, that's when they become the ultimate, the Grail Knights. The Duke himself had never reached that point. He got called back on his errantry and ended up running the Dukedom of Bordeleaux till this day. He's never really trusted anyone to take it over, because if you do undertake questing to become a Grail Knight, you essentially have to give up all your claims to land and title, at least temporarily, while you go away on this quest. So someone else would have to run the dukedom in his stead, and he's never really found anyone worthy. His eldest son, Pharamond, would make a good leader, but Pharamond himself is undergoing his questing duties, is looking to become a Grail Knight in his own right, so he can't come back at this point in time. Now, the age of Alberic is starting to catch up with him, and he feels it's sort of now or never. So the word is around Bordeleaux at the moment that Alberic is looking to find a steward to look after his dukedom while he's away and finally completes his Grail quest. Now, in terms of Alberic's appearance, we can kind of guess that he'll look very much like any of the other Bretonnian knights that we have commonly seen in the game and in the Warhammer tabletop already. In terms of his items, we have no idea, but we can kind of speculate on a couple of things that Total War Warhammer may take into consideration for his character at least on the campaign level. Because he's not a Grail Knight, and he is very stern on the knights he has, and it's a very small and elite household of knights he has under his command, perhaps he'd get a lot of bonuses to Knights of the Realms and Knights Errant, rather than Questing Knights and Grail Knights, which maybe Lioncoeur will have instead. So you'd make him a campaign general that would give bonuses to the lower tier knights, the Errant Knights and the Knights of the Realm. You could maybe play a nice aspect of his character off with the worship of Manan, maybe make his lance that he would almost inevitably have on horseback be a sort of a trident-headed lance, so a three-pronged lance. That would be a nice little touch and a shout-out to the worship of Manan within the realm of Bordeleaux. And you'd have to make him unbreakable, I think. I think making him unbreakable would be a nice touch, because he's very well reputed for his courage and his honor, and it's one of the virtues of, you can sort of assign disciplines to certain knights on the tabletop version, and the sign for Bordeleaux is one of discipline in itself. So discipline and courage, and to accentuate that, you could make him unbreakable, and even maybe give him the ability to make Knights Errant and Knights of the Realm unbreakable within his army as well. That would be a nice little touch for Alberic to have. So that about sums it up for Alberic. As I said, there's not really a lot to go on. I hope you guys found this video helpful. I look forward to finishing off the series with the Fey Enchantress at some point in the next couple of weeks. But yes, Alberic we're going to have, despite the fact we may not know him. And I look forward to some of the other lords I mentioned at the top of the video. Let me know in the comments if you'd maybe like me to do a Missing Legendary Lords video for the Bretonnians that features some of those characters I mentioned at the top of this video. Anyway, guys, please do subscribe for more content on Total War Warhammer on my channel, along with some other strategy games. And thank you very much for joining me. Hope you all have a great day.